Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone. Well, it's been a week since the release of the brand new Justice League film, and for those of you who watched my video review that I posted on this channel last week of that movie, you will remember that I said that I thought that Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice was a better movie than the Justice League was. Now, in this video today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain exactly why I think that is the case. I'm going to go into a bit more detail and explain to you why I think it is that Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice, hands down, is a better movie than what Justice League was. A couple of things that I need to point out before we get started. First of all, and probably pretty obviously, there's going to be a few spoilers in this particular video. So if you haven't seen either movie and you don't want either of them spoiled, then you probably want to pause this, go and watch the films, and then come back after you've seen them. Secondly, and this is a really important point, when I talk about Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice, I am not talking about the theatrical version of the film. The reason I'm not talking about the theatrical version of the film is because that is not actually the film that Zack Snyder created and wrote, directed, put together, edited, and created as his final version of the film. In actual fact, the theatrical release was the studio version, and the studio butchered approximately 30 minutes of footage, most of which, almost all of which, is actually essential to the heart of the story, to character development and everything else that was in Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice. The two movies really are like night and day, like chalk and cheese. And so the simple fact is that this is the film that Zack Snyder actually created and was robbed of by the studio. So I am comparing here the Ultimate Edition, which came out on home theatre release, versus the Justice League cinematic release. Now, I don't know if the Justice League is all of a sudden going to get better if we see an extended cut with a whole lot of footage that was actually, again, butchered out by the studios. I don't know if that exists, and I don't know if we're ever going to see it. But at this stage, in this video, what I'm comparing is the theatrical release of Justice League versus that Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice Ultimate Edition. So with that in mind, let's get into it. The first point of comparison I want to make between these two films is right at the very beginning of both films, the opening sequence. And I think it's fair to say that Batman v Superman, hands down, has the far better opening sequence. In fact, Batman v Superman really has two opening sequences that are sort of strung together quite closely. There's a brief little opening sequence of the killing of Batman's parents, and I think it's one of the best versions of the killing of Batman's parents that we've ever seen put to film. I just stylistically, I love it. Visually, I love it. And also there's some really cool little things in it that I really enjoyed. One thing in particular is, if you go back and watch it, if you haven't seen it since, is that you actually see Bruce Wayne's father rushing at the mugger with the gun. You see him literally, you watch his hand, there's this really great and very brief shot, and it shows him starting to swing his arm, clearly in defense of his family, and he's swinging his arm at that mugger, and that obviously results in this horrific murder that follows. Now, why I loved that was because it actually, in a very subtle but powerful way, sets up the character of Bruce Wayne that we meet in this movie. He is also very emotional and, I would say, impetuous in this film. He's not really getting his facts in order. He is being driven more by his emotions in this movie than he is by cold logic. And that little simple scene, that very brief couple of seconds, it's not even probably that, with his father, and that scene at the beginning it was a great way to set that all up. But visually, that's a great setup. And then we move very quickly into the scenes which take place towards the end of the Man of Steel movie, where General Zod and Superman are fighting, and they are destroying all sorts of land and property and buildings throughout Metropolis. And one of those buildings happens to be a Wayne Enterprises building. And in that building, we have Jack O'Dwyer. Jack O'Dwyer is the CEO, the manager, the guy in charge who works for Wayne Enterprises. And for a brief period, he is on the phone to Bruce Wayne, who initially tells him, look, get everyone out of the building. This is not a good place to be. And what we see interesting with that character of Jack O'Dwyer is that Jack O'Dwyer stays in the building to the very end. So it really shows in a very simple but very powerful way that he is a man of virtue. He cares enough about other people to actually make sure that everyone is safely out of the building first. These are little simple things, but they're really powerful and have quite a profound impact when it comes to storytelling. And then you have that really beautiful moment where the phone is cut off, when he's talking to Bruce Wayne, and he realizes when Superman and Zod hit the building that he's not going to get out of the building alive. The building obviously pancakes and falls down, and he obviously goes with the building. And as he realizes that he is dying, he makes there's this beautiful, simple little scene where he makes this final act of contrition, this final prayer, of delivering his life into the hands of God. It's a pretty old school thing to do. If you're an old school Anglican or an old school Catholic, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about here. And it's a powerful moment though. What, interestingly enough, that opening sequence did, apart from the fact that it's action-packed, it's exhilarating, visually it's stunning, and it sets up some really important things in the film, is it actually did something that was essential to the plot of this movie, and in a far better way than what Captain America Civil War did. And interestingly, both of these films rely on the same plot device, if you like. And that plot device is this idea that superheroes cause collateral damage, and that collateral damage is horrific, and some people don't think it's acceptable. In Batman v Superman, obviously it's Batman who thinks that the collateral damage that's being caused by Superman basically signifies the fact that this new superhero is actually a very serious and dangerous threat to the planet that has to be neutralized, or we need to be protected against in some way. In Captain America Civil War, it's obviously the thing that's supposed to set up the civil war that exists in the Avengers. But here's the thing, Captain America Civil War does not set that important plot point up very well at all. You just, like, they show it to you, but it just doesn't feel that meaningful. Whereas Zack Snyder, with that opening sequence of Batman v Superman, with that one simple little scene with Jack O'Dwyer, where he makes that final little prayer before he dies, and where Bruce Wayne is on the phone to him, we are talking about maybe a couple of seconds worth of footage. Jack O'Dwyer is maybe in this movie for a minute at absolute most. That's probably the total amount of screen time that character has. And yet in that 1 minute, and with his involvement in the way those scenes are crafted, you set up perfectly the actual profound emotional impact of what collateral damage would actually look like and how it would affect people in a real and meaningful way in this world. And that actually sets up the rest of the film, and it does it really, really well. Captain America Civil War, you don't ever feel that profound emotional impact. You're told it's this thing, but it never really feels that legitimate or real. And so I think it's easy to see why Justice League it just doesn't compare. You've got the scene with Batman and stuff going on the roof, and to be honest with you, it does. I've heard some critics say it feels like a 90s movie, and I think it's probably not a bad criticism, to be fair. It doesn't at all feel consistent with the tone of what we saw, even though it is darker than some of the other stuff in the film. Clearly, I think Justice League suffered a little bit from that whole edict from above that you must lighten the tone of these movies, and I'm not sure that was actually a good idea for Justice League, but you can see these Batman scenes don't quite have that same gravitas and depth of sort of perhaps menace, creeping doom, depressive darkness, whatever you want to call it, that is very much present. And certainly I think the excitement and the exhilaration was far greater in that opening sequence of Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice. The next point of contrast between the two films is the visuals, and I'm talking here about the cinematography and the CGI. And I don't think you have to be a genius to recognise that Batman v Superman, hands down, it beats Justice League when it comes to the visuals. The CGI, well, Steppenwolf, the CGI in Steppenwolf just wasn't good. It just wasn't good. Again, I've heard other people compare him to some sort of 90s or early 2000s video game character, and that's how bad the CGI looks, and I agree. It just, like, think about this. We have had CGI that is far superior to this many, many, many years ago. Think about the Lord of the Rings and Gollum, for example. And the best they could serve up was what we got with Steppenwolf, and it's just not good enough. So that issue is just not present with Batman v Superman. The visuals are much better in Batman v Superman. The cinematography is much better. There's, I think, a couple of times there was some interesting problems with lighting, and I think this is perhaps where Joss Whedon came in and adjusted the lighting of certain sequences, because you can see that, say, the Batman costume, it definitely doesn't look as good in the way those reshoots or certain scenes have been shot, lighting-wise. but you can imagine it looking a lot better the way Zack Snyder shoots those films, with a lot more darkness in the tone and the visual contrast and the way he shoots. And without that, the actual Batman costume looks a bit rubbery at times. So I think, again, it's fair to say that Justice League, no, CGI and visuals, the win here definitely goes to Batman v Superman. The next point of contrast between the two movies is the plot. Now, the plot of Justice League, I think, was too rushed, and it's lacking substance as a result. There's just character development and plot development that, well, they had to rush it, and you really do notice that. Whereas Batman v Superman, there's a bit more substance there. And because they took their time, there's more substance in the actual plot, and I think that does make a huge difference. Although I will say that with Batman v Superman, one of the weaknesses that it had, that Justice League doesn't have, is the way in which it chose to set up the whole Steppenwolf thing, and just with that dream sequence. I think those scenes, they were, to my way of thinking, they were one of the biggest weaknesses of Batman v Superman. Look, they were visually great, but plot-wise, they sort of bog things down. They don't really fit in a coherent way, and they don't really pay off, I think, as well as they could have in Justice League. And perhaps part of that is because things were rushed. But I think, though, a slight edge here really has to go to Batman v Superman, because there's more substance to the story, there's more substance to the plot, and the reason for that is because they are not rushing through it. The next point of contrast is the pacing of the two movies. Now, obviously, as I said, Batman v Superman was not rushed, whereas Justice League is rushed. And the difference, obviously, in the pacing, it's faster in Justice League, but the story actually suffers as a result. Whereas what you get with Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice is you get a more slow but deliberate pace. It never feels lethargic. It never feels like it gets bogged down. Interestingly enough, again, contrasting it with Civil War, at times I felt that Civil War just ground to a big halt of a talk fest. You never really felt that with Batman v Superman. Even at points where, there was exposition and other things happening, there was still something visual or something interesting on screen happening to keep your interest. And so I feel that Batman v Superman has an edge here because of the fact that even though it was slow, it was deliberate, and it allowed the story to actually flourish in a really good way. Whereas the quicker, faster pacing of Justice League, although it might appeal to some Marvel fans, it meant that the story, the way they achieved that was by cutting big chunks out of the story. And so in this case, I think, if you like, even though you might prefer faster paced movies, I think this was definitely a weakness when compared to Batman v Superman. Another interesting point of contrast between the two films are their respective villains. Now, the villain, obviously, in Batman v Superman is Lex Luthor. Yes, Doomsday is in this, but Doomsday really is a monster who is at the service of Lex Luthor. Lex Luthor is by far and away the villain of that particular film. Meanwhile, in Justice League, we have Steppenwolf. And for Steppenwolf, he's inferior to Lex Luthor. Not only is there the issue with the CGI and the fact that they didn't put a man in a costume, I really don't know why they didn't do that, but on top of that is the fact that he is very generic. And this is the thing that DC, for me, this is a real disappointment, because DC are known for having a far better stable of villains. And to be fair, in most of the movies, and even in Man of Steel and Batman v Superman, you have a much stronger, more developed and more interesting villain. Now, I know some people didn't necessarily like everything that Jesse Eisenberg did with his portrayal of Lex Luthor. I get it. I understand that. There were some people who just didn't like Lex Luthor in Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice. But you cannot fault, when you put these two villains side by side, you cannot fault the fact that in Batman v Superman you have a far more interesting villain. There's more going on there. There is a more nefarious and almost crazy tone to him, like you would expect from a mad, evil genius. The portrayal is more full-on, it's more out there. Steppenwolf is just generic. He is literally almost like just a generic placeholder who they need to do certain villainous things so that our heroes can sort of have their screen time and show off how awesome their powers are and their skills are and their teamwork is. And it like for me in my last review, as I said, Steppenwolf literally feels like a Saturday morning cartoon character who has been put into a live action movie, and literally a Saturday morning cartoon drawn character who has been put into a live action movie. And very much his character is like that as well. It's almost paint by numbers villainy, whereas what you get with Lex Luthor and Batman v Superman is a far more developed and interesting villain, even if you didn't like everything about that particular portrayal. Here's an interesting point of contrast between the two films. The characters, the way the characters are portrayed, the type of characters we see in the film, and the way in which the characters all work together, or don't work together in the film. And I think that Justice League actually has a slight advantage here. I think Justice League, for a couple of reasons, it is pretty close, but I think that Justice League had The Flash. He's a great new addition to the whole DC cinematic universe. I also think that Cyborg, that these two characters are really interesting, and they just brought something a little bit different and new here to this universe. I also think that with Batman v Superman, at times there wasn't enough of a contrast between Batman and Superman. They both seem to be two brooding sides, dark and brooding sides of the same coin. Now, I don't think you can ever repeat a Christopher Reeve style version of Superman, and you can't do a halfway house. They already tried that with the Bryan Singer Superman movie. So a lot of people seem to have forgotten that, and it didn't work. It just didn't work. So Zack Snyder has to do what he's done, I think, with the Superman character, but I do think in Batman v Superman it got a little bit too dark, and they were both too brooding, and they didn't need to be. It's interesting when you read the original Frank Miller graphic novel series, the Dark Knight graphic novel series that he produced, you realize in that battle between Superman and Batman, Superman is not a dark and brooding character like he is in Batman v Superman, and so there is still a contrast there, even though it's obviously a lot harder edged and more cynical, that particular graphic novel. In the film, there's just no real contrast between the characters. You just didn't have that issue at all with Justice League. I think it handled the difference between the two a lot better. And I think the other thing too that was interesting was the whole team factor in Justice League is much better, I think. Now, I get it. Batman v Superman is not really a team film, although there is a big component of it that is about the Justice League and about teamwork and stuff like that. I just feel that the characters each had unique and interesting parts to play in the Justice League film, whereas in Batman v Superman, perhaps it was just a bit too much of the same thing. And even Wonder Woman, I think, suffers from it a little bit. She seems, I don't know, she just seems really far too serious for her own good. And she, interestingly, could have been more of a foil. Even if you wanted to have a darker Superman, I think she could have been perhaps more of a jovial or more light-hearted foil to those two characters. But in the end, it just doesn't really happen that particularly well. So I think when it comes to characters and what we saw on screen, I think the edge, it's a slight edge, but I think it does have to go to the Justice League. The last point of contrast I want to make between the two films is the whole area of their respective soundtracks. And again, this is like night and day, chalk and cheese. There is a gap between these two films so big that you could drive a fully loaded truck and trailer through it. And the winner, by a long shot, is Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice. The soundtrack on that is phenomenal. It's one of the best movie soundtracks that I've heard. I'm a musician, and I do appreciate movie soundtracks, and I am somewhat of perhaps an amateur connoisseur of movie soundtracks, and I think that the Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice soundtrack was one of the best movie soundtracks that we've actually heard in a long time. It had just so many unique and cool little things to it, and there's lots of great little melodies and refrains throughout this film. If you don't believe me, go and listen to Beautiful Lie, This Is My World, The Red Capes Are Coming, which is the Lex Luthor theme. Even though I wasn't a huge fan of it, I also think that the Is She With You, which is the Wonder Woman theme, was quite good. As far as, I guess, musical compositions that stick out in films, it's just hands down, there are far more and far better actual musical moments, melodies, refrains, an overall score that is far better in Batman v Superman than what we got in Justice League. The soundtrack in Justice League at times, it just sounds like generic stock music. At times, at the beginning, I thought it was going to rise to greatness. I thought, oh, we're going to get something interesting here. But it just doesn't. It just falls flat. And interestingly enough, one or two of the key moments, he's actually borrowing from other people's previously written music. And that's where it gets a bit more interesting. So, yeah, by a long shot. And if you don't believe me, actually take the time. Spend a couple of hours listening, and you can listen to them all on YouTube. Listen and compare the two different soundtracks, and you will easily see that there are far more impressive musical moments, and there is overall a far better score that we heard in Batman v Superman. And I think the other thing too was it was interesting, it was unique, and it really fit the whole tone of everything that we saw in that film, whereas it's just missing from Justice League. And in some ways, some might say that perhaps that disadvantaged the movie, or perhaps is a reflection of the fact that Justice League is maybe only so-so as a film, whereas Batman v Superman was definitely something a bit more special. So there you have it. There's my in-depth contrasting between the two films and why I think that Batman v Superman is a far superior film to what Justice League was. Now, in summary, I guess you could sum it up like this, that whether you love it or you hate it, Batman v Superman, there's just no way that you can accuse it of being another bland, carbon copy superhero film. It is absolutely not. Even if you don't like the darker tone, which I do, I am a fan of the Frank Miller graphic novels, the Batman, the Dark Knight series, which really reinvigorated Batman, by the way. And so for me, that was what I looked to, I guess, as the source material coming into this film, and I was not disappointed. For me, what Zack Snyder did, and which no other comic book movie director has done, as far as I'm concerned to date, is he actually took a comic book and brought it to life. For me, this was like watching a comic book come to life. And I know some people don't like that, particularly if you're a big Marvel fan, you're not going to like that. Marvel have gone a different way. Instead of creating comic books on screen, what they've done is they've taken their comic book superhero characters and they have tended to create action, sci-fi, fantasy films and do it that way. And it's working well for them, I think. By and large, it's working well for them. However, I really respect the fact that what DC did here and what Zack Snyder did was he actually created a comic book on the screen. And I think visually it is a feast, and there are some awesome action set pieces. The soundtrack is amazing. There's some really interesting depth to these characters, and I'm okay with that. I don't mind going to see a superhero film that is not necessarily designed for kids, and I don't mean full of gore and violence and sex, but I mean it just has a bit more depth and something a little bit more interesting going on there, and possibly a darker tone. And obviously Batman v Superman does have all of those things, and so for me, I really enjoyed it. But I know some people didn't like it and they think it failed as a film. But here's the thing, even if you thought that Batman v Superman failed as a film, you'd have to say that, like I said, there's no way that you could consider Batman v Superman, even if you think it was a failure, to be just another carbon copy, sort of generic paint-by-numbers superhero movie. It was not at all. It was unique, and it had something really, I think it captured something important, and I think it actually did it pretty good. Now, others are going to disagree about how well it did it, but there's no doubt it wasn't just a formulaic paint-by-numbers film. However, Justice League does feel a little bit too formulaic, and clearly what the studios have done here, first of all with this absurd demand that you're only allowed to make a 2-hour film, but on top of that, clearly there's been an edict that you must lighten the tone of the film, and I think the fact they had 2 directors involved through unfortunate and tragic circumstances had a bearing on the tone of the film as well, and as a result, this feels more generic. It feels more paint by numbers. It feels, interestingly enough, like a film that could actually be a Marvel movie. And that's possibly why some of the critics are praising this more than they did Batman v Superman, even though I think Batman v Superman is a better film. And I think the reason the critics are praising it is because they've become so obsessed with Marvel that they now expect every single superhero film to be one of 2 things. Either a carbon copy of what Marvel does, or some sort of dark, brooding indie film where the superhero is this terribly flawed and horrible or dysfunctional character. And if you don't fit either of those 2 molds, then you don't get the seal of approval. And obviously, Batman v Superman broke the mold in that regard. The Justice League film, it just feels a little bit like it's too formulaic and like they've tried too hard to copy the Marvel formula. But guess what? The Marvel formula is not the DC formula, and I don't think it works. Hopefully it doesn't sink the cinematic universe, and hopefully going forward they give creative control back to guys like Zack Snyder and other directors who are going to give us something that is a bit more of a comic book come to life on the screen. Thanks for watching. Thanks for your support. I've hit over 2,000 subscribers now, over 2,500 subscribers at this stage at the time of making this video. So a huge thank you to everyone who's been with me and has decided to get on board for the rest of the journey, whatever may be in store. Don't forget, I've also set up a Patreon. I'd love to make more of these videos, but it's really just a timing thing and a funding thing. And if you like what I'm doing and you think it's worth making a contribution towards, you think there's something informative or entertaining about what I do, and you'd like to see more of it, then please get onto my Patreon page. The link is on screen below now. Or in the video description below, there's a link directly to the Patreon page. And with your support, I could do more of this, and I would ideally like to be able to actually start a monthly podcast as well. So please check it out on the link below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time on Left Foot Media.